Catus, Maximus here. This is going to be a quick little review of the second generation OEM tools rear brake caliper tool. So on many, especially almost all import automobiles and many domestic automobiles, the rear brake caliper is integrated with the parking brake. If you have drum brakes in the rear, then the parking brake actually just pulls the cable and pulls the brake shoes out. But on most vehicles with rear disc brakes, there's actually the parking brake cable integrates into the caliper, and when you pull that cable, it actually pushes the brake pistons as the parking brake. It's just doing it mechanically instead of hydraulically. And it is the emergency brakes. They just transitioned to being called parking brakes because brake systems are much more reliable. On that style where the cable is integrated into the caliper, so when you pull on the parking brake, the pistons move in. That is done on a ratcheting mechanism. So when you change the brake pads, you need to be able to get that piston to move back in. And on like front brakes, you just use a C-clamp and you just slowly push in the piston. On the rear, since there's a ratcheting mechanism, there'll be these two, sometimes there's two cutouts, sometimes there's three. That's why they have a 3-post side and a 2-post side. You'll put this in there, and then this is something that you turn with a ratchet, 3/8 in this case, to screw it in to get that caliper piston to retract so you can replace your pads. There are exceptions like Toyotas, which have rear disc brakes, and then inside the hat of the disc brake rotor, there's some drum brakes. It's actually really weird. Second generation. First generation ones actually look like these, and I read some reviews. I've actually liked these for a variety, these first generation ones for a variety of reasons, but people had issues because the metal was a little thin. This is just a socket with a couple pegs coming out. They go through a couple little arms right there and just move these posts back and forth. People have had some issues on really stuck brake calipers where these have broken. The second issue is on some style automobiles, the edges on the inside are kind of tapered instead of being square. And the nature of this type of adapter is as you're turning, it's also squeezing in really tight. For me, I actually like that because it keeps it really well centered, and the pegs are pretty long and they're screwed together, so if they get filled with brake dust and grit, you can just take them apart and completely clean them. But they sold them as two different ones. They're also really compact, and here's the 3-post one. Unfortunately, OEM Tools got wind of those issues, so what they said is we're just going to come out with a heavier duty version. One of the things I don't like about this new version, I should say, is that the posts, they're just not quite as long, so you really have to keep this really flat, otherwise they'll really want to slip. But how this design works is they have the center 3/8 piece. It has two halves. They have, two cutouts there, 3 cutouts here. Those are actually press fit onto this piece, and it is sandwiching this little wheel, which moves the pegs back and forth on both sides simultaneously. What this steel wheel has is a track, and there's one track with wider variations for the 2-pin side, and then another track on this side which has tighter variations because it has to move 3 pins instead of 2 pins. And so as you rotate this around, the pins go back and forth. And once you have it set in a particular position and then you're putting torque on it, there is no force going inwards. There are really cheap versions of these tools, which are the little blocks, and I haven't seen them, but they're very recognizable. They just look like a little 1-inch block that has like weird, on each side there's like a weird different a style of pins, and it has a bunch of square holes in it, which are 3/8 drive. And those have been like the universal tool for years, but it's kind of nice to have these heavier duty ones. So some of the and then I should finish about the assembly. So besides the tracks, then these are just floating pins. The back of them sits in the track. They have a little flange that prevents them from falling out. And then what actually provides the stability is just this 1/4-inch thick piece of steel. It's just the walls of these slots that are holding the pins, and I think that they could have made it just a little bit tighter. I know that he made it a little bit looser so it'd be easier to use in conditions such as, the suspension and brake dust, etc. Stuff that's close to the ground. But they could have made them a little bit tighter. That will be one comment, although I think it does work okay. So after they assemble it, they press these halves together. And these are tiny little grub screws. They're on opposite sides of each other. They don't go all the way through. But the purpose of that is to really ensure that these halves stay together. And when you're torquing on really stubborn brake calipers that this centerpiece won't want to twist and turn. Because even though it's press fit, there's just only so much contact area in there, so I kind of like that. The issue is that this will inevitably get a bunch of crud built up in there inside the tracks that these pins are riding in, and then that will start giving you issues. Crud will build up between these two halves here, so you'll really have to oil this, and I suspect after quite a bit of use, it's going to get frustrating to operate. If this ever gets left outside and rusts, you're going to have to take it apart, and that's really tough because you have to pull out the two microscopic grub screws. You're going to have to press this thing out, or the centerpiece out, and to reassemble it, you're going to have to get these two halves exactly lined up as you press it back together. Otherwise, you won't be able to screw the little grub screws back in. So it's a heavy-duty design, but they made some sacrifices to accomplish it. Although it is handy because I do like how it doesn't pull inwards. Some situations I like that, but on calipers where they have just a slight taper where it wants to pop out, it can be real frustrating to use this style where it constantly is pushing in. And usually you have to use these with an extension or something just to get past the little fork in the caliper. You drop this down and you start turning it in. And so that's one of the things is this is probably going to not be an issue in most situations, but maybe on a little smart vehicle or something like that, maybe even the thickness of this, if you had totally worn out pads on top of a worn brake rotor, that piston may come out so far that this thickness here, which is like 3/4 of an inch, may or may not give you trouble. And so that's the other nice thing about these older ones is, of course, the flange is much thinner, so these will fit into any situation. These can also be handy as just pin spanner sockets. There's a variety of situations, and you can't use these on grinders because they don't have enough reach, but there's many types of fasteners, say on DeWalt Skills worm drive saws, where they have the front gear case cover is actually just a 2-pin system, and so these types of sockets actually have more uses than just rear brake calipers. A little tip on using these is, of course, the wobble extension, one that in particular doesn't have the ability to like push in and lock, because it's just so difficult to keep these things straight and they always want to slip. You get the little wobble extension on there, or a universal impact style universal joint. I don't recommend standard universal joints because the deal is that you have to push in, but when you're using a wobble or a impact type universal joint, you're able to push and get some good twisting force, and it's really difficult to operate a ratchet and just keep it absolutely dead straight. So if you have just something that gives you just a little bit of flexibility, like a wobble extension in there, you'll actually have a lot better luck using these types of tools, just because then you're able to push on there. This wants to stay flat against the piston, and you're able to have just a little bit of free movement as you're working the ratchet. That one aspect actually helps quite a bit. Anyway, sorry for the short video that ends up being long. That seems to be a trend on my channel, but just wanted to bring you this little OEM Tools second generation rear brake caliper tool and give you my opinions and even compare against the first generation one. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed to the Catus Maximus channel, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.